The arena lights dim. A guitar riff tears through the air. A towering figure rips open his shirt as thousands erupt in unison. Hogan, Hogan. For decades, this man was more than a wrestler. He was a symbol, a cultural force, a household name. This is the story of Hulk Hogan, born Terry Boller, the boy from Tampa who became the face of professional wrestling. From his humble beginnings to global superstardom, through scandals, triumphs, and reinvention, we will explore the life of a man who defined an era. Across 12 chapters, you'll see how he rose, how he fell, and how he left behind a legacy that still shapes wrestling and popular culture today. If you enjoy this style of storytelling, consider subscribing. It helps us bring more long-form documentaries like this one to you. And let us know in the comments where and when you're watching. Drop your city, your country, even the time of day. We'd love to hear from you. The story begins in Augusta, Georgia, on August 11th, 1953. The American South was still in the long shadow of the post-war years. The country was prospering, but cracks ran deep. Racial tension, cultural shifts, and the first signs of a restless new generation stirred in the background. Into this moment came Terry Gene Bollea, the boy who would one day be known to the world as Hulk Hogan. Terry's family moved soon after his birth. By the time he was a toddler, their roots had settled in Tampa, Florida. Tampa was not yet the booming city it would later become. It was a humid, working-class town on the Gulf Coast, a place of fishing docks, cigar factories, and neighborhoods where everyone seemed to know each other's business. The summers were heavy with the smell of salt air and orange blossoms. Life there could be simple, but it was never easy. His father, Pietro Pete Bollea, was the son of Italian immigrants. He worked as a construction foreman, a man hardened by labor and long days in the Florida heat. Pete carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who measured worth in sweat and discipline. He was stern, but not without pride in his family. Respect, he believed, had to be earned inside the house as much as outside it. His mother, Ruth, came from a different world. She was a homemaker of Scottish and French descent, softer in voice but firm in values. Ruth provided warmth and stability, creating a household where family dinners mattered, and where faith and tradition formed a steady backdrop. While Pete demanded discipline, Ruth offered comfort. It was this balance, steel from his father, shelter from his mother, that shaped the boy's earliest sense of himself. The Boller household was modest. They lived in a small single-story home, the kind of place where rooms felt close and voices carried. There was no luxury, only necessity. Summers meant open windows and box fans rattling against the sticky heat. Winters, mild by northern standards, still brought the damp chill that crept into the walls. For Terry, childhood was framed by this environment of modest means and ordinary struggle. Even as a child, Terry stood out. He was large for his age, tall and broad-shouldered by the time he entered grade school. His size earned him attention in the neighborhood, but also responsibility. Pete expected his son to carry himself with discipline, not arrogance. Ruth reminded him to treat others with kindness, no matter how different they were. At school, Terry was shy at first. He was not the brash showman the world would one day know. Instead, he carried himself quietly, listening more than he spoke. But inside, there was a spark, a restless energy that craved outlets. He was fascinated by sports, captivated by the larger-than-life heroes of baseball and wrestling. His earliest love was music. Long before the world knew him as Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea picked up a guitar. By his early teens, he spent hours practicing, drawn to the rhythm and power of rock and roll. The cultural backdrop of the 1960s was impossible to ignore. Tampa's neighborhoods buzzed with the sounds of jukeboxes, the rising tide of youth culture, and the steady march of civil rights struggles. The world was changing fast, and Terry was growing up right in the middle of it. Television brought new heroes into the living room, flamboyant wrestlers in colorful masks, ball players hitting impossible home runs, entertainers who seemed to radiate confidence. For a boy searching for identity, these figures left a mark. Family life, though steady, was not without tension. Pete's stern approach sometimes clashed with Ruth's softer touch. Terry often found himself in between, yearning to prove himself to his father, while turning to his mother for encouragement. He was not an only child, but he often felt like he carried expectations larger than his years. His natural size and presence made him stand out, and with that came pressure to live up to something greater. Neighbors remember him as the boy who always seemed to have a ball, a bat, or a guitar in hand. He was never idle, If he wasn't outside with friends, he was inside, eyes fixed on the television as professional wrestlers strutted and shouted across the screen. Even then, he wasn't just watching the fights, he studied the way the crowd reacted. He noticed how the men in the ring controlled the room without saying much at all. It was theatre as much as sport, and something about that combination fascinated him. In those early years, there were no signs of the bright lights or the roaring arenas to come. He was simply Terry, a boy from a modest home in Tampa, raised by hard-working parents carrying the weight of his father's expectations and his mother's devotion. But within him, the seeds of something larger had already been planted. His size, his fascination with performance, and his restless drive set him apart. And soon, that spark of curiosity, the desire to become more than ordinary, would find its first flame. By the late 1960s, Tampa was alive with the sound of rock and roll. The Vietnam War raged overseas, protests echoed on college campuses, and American culture was shifting under the weight of rebellion and change. For a tall, broad-shouldered teenager named Terry Bollea, the noise of the outside world mixed with a rhythm of his own. Music had become his first passion. With a second-hand guitar strapped across his chest, Terry spent countless hours practicing chords until his fingers burned. He played in garages, in cramped living rooms, and eventually on small stages in smoky Tampa bars. The dream of becoming a professional musician seemed real. He loved the energy of the crowd, the feeling of commanding attention. But it was not music that would ultimately define him. His real calling appeared in a very different setting. The first spark came from a chance encounter. Terry and his friends often hung around the local gyms, curious about the athletes inside. One afternoon, they wandered into a weightlifting club tucked behind an old strip mall. The smell of iron and sweat filled the air. The sound of clanging plates echoed against cinder-block walls. Posters of musclemen with impossible physiques lined the room, their arms crossed, eyes glaring down as if issuing a challenge. Terry stood taller than most of the men there, but he felt small in comparison to the bodies before him. He watched as lifters pushed massive weights with a mix of raw effort and perfect discipline. Something stirred inside him. It was the same excitement he had once felt watching larger-than-life wrestlers on television, but now it was real. It was within reach. Among those lifters was a man named Hiro Matsuda. Born in Japan, Matsuda was a professional wrestler and respected trainer. He carried himself with quiet authority, every move precise, every word sharp. To young men in Tampa, he was both mysterious and intimidating. Terry noticed him instantly. Matsuda represented everything Terry lacked: discipline, mastery, control of both body and spirit. Where Terry was still rough, Matsuda was polished. Where Terry dreamed, Matsuda embodied reality. The moment struck Terry with the force of revelation. He didn't just want to watch, he wanted to become. From that day forward, the gym became his second home. The clang of weights replaced the chords of his guitar. He woke with sore muscles and calloused hands, yet he returned each day hungrier than before. The transformation was addictive. Each week his frame grew thicker, his strength greater. The shy boy who once kept to himself now carried an aura that drew attention wherever he went. But ambition rarely comes without resistance. Terry's father, Pete, was skeptical. Construction work was hard enough, and he doubted that lifting weights or chasing dreams in smoky gyms would lead to anything better. To Pete, a steady job and a stable life mattered more than chasing fame. Music won't feed you, he had said before. Now the same doubt hung over Terry's new obsession. Wrestling, bodybuilding, the pursuit of strength. It all looked like a distraction from reality. Terry listened, but he did not yield. If anything, the disapproval only sharpened his resolve. The more others doubted, the more determined he became. Friends teased him for spending hours under the barbell. Teachers warned him not to waste his size on foolish dreams. But inside, he felt a fire that none of them could put out. He devoured magazines like Muscle Builder and Wrestling Review, studying the bodies and personas of the men who had turned strength into spectacle. He traced their routines, memorized their diets, and imagined himself among them. These figures were not just athletes. They were characters larger than life, commanding crowds with every movement. That blend of performance and power called to him in a way nothing else had. In the evenings, after long hours in the gym, he would sit with his guitar, the strings quiet beneath his fingers. Music was still part of him, but he knew now it was not the main stage. Something bigger waited ahead, something that required not just talent, but transformation. Hiro Matsuda noticed the boy who kept showing up, day after day, pushing harder than most. He saw potential in the size, but also in the persistence. When Matsuda finally agreed to train him, it was not a gift, it was a trial by fire. Matsuda's sessions were brutal. Hours of drills, endless repetitions, demands that seemed designed to break him. Terry was slammed to the mat until his body ached. Matsuda wanted to see if the boy would quit. Terry did not. Every painful session only confirmed his desire. He would endure anything to earn his place. By the early 1970s, his plan was clear. He would become a professional wrestler. He would take the lessons from Matsuda, the strength from the gym, the rhythm from his days in music, and fuse them into something new, something unforgettable. He no longer dreamed in vague shapes. He envisioned himself in arenas, standing under bright lights, the crowd chanting his name. It was no longer fantasy, it was the path, and he was ready to walk it. In Tampa, the idea of chasing fame through professional wrestling was almost laughable. For most families in the late 1960s and early 1970s, success meant stability, a steady job, a modest home, and the ability to provide for your family. Dreams of standing in a spotlight, of becoming larger than life, were treated with suspicion, something for the movies, not for ordinary people. For Terry Bowler, the resistance came first from within his own house. His father, Pete, had spent his life under the Florida sun, building with his hands. He believed in hard work, in schedules that began before dawn, in wages earned by sweat and calloused palms. Wrestling, to Pete, it looked like a carnival sideshow, part theatre, part stunt, and nothing a man could rely on to put food on the table. He reminded his son of this often. "You're a big kid," Pete would say, "but size doesn't pay bills." His mother, Ruth, though gentler in tone, shared the same worry. She wanted security for her boy. Wrestling was unpredictable, dangerous, filled with men who burned out quickly. She looked at Terry's guitar and thought perhaps music would be safer, though even that felt like chasing smoke. To her, the best path was the most ordinary: school, work, family, the kind of life she understood. Beyond the walls of the Beaulieu home, the skepticism was even sharper. Tampa was not New York or Los Angeles. It was a working-class city with deep roots in fishing, shipping, and blue-collar trades. Neighbors judged ambition harshly, especially ambition that reached too far. To stand out was to risk ridicule. For a boy to say he wanted to be a professional wrestler was to invite laughter. Wrestling was entertainment, not a career. It was seen as fake, even shameful. No parent bragged about their son dreaming of the ring. At school, the comments followed him. Friends questioned why he spent hours in the gym instead of hanging out, why he obsessed over magazines filled with oiled, flexing men in trunks. Teachers warned him to focus on something practical, reminding him that few ever made it out of Tampa on dreams alone. He was told over and over that he would regret wasting his time. The obstacles were real. Money was tight in the Boller household. Training required time, equipment, and eventually travel. Wrestling schools charged fees. Wrestling itself often paid little to beginners, if it paid at all. Terry knew his family could not bankroll his ambitions. Whatever he achieved would have to come from his own effort. Inside, he wrestled with doubt. There were nights when he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the Florida humidity thick in the air, wondering if everyone else was right. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe the weight of expectation from his father and the scorn from his peers was too much. Perhaps he should set the guitar down, stop chasing the ring, and follow the path everyone else followed. But each time the doubt rose, something stronger answered. He thought of the gym, the clang of weights, the faces of men transformed by discipline. He thought of the wrestlers on television, their voices booming, their movements commanding the crowd. He remembered the way his body felt after training, sore but alive, and the rush of knowing he was building himself into something more. Doubt, he realized, was fuel. Every dismissive glance, every mocking laugh, every warning from his father only pressed him harder. He began to see resistance not as a wall, but as proof he was stepping onto a road few dared to walk. So he made his choice. He would endure the scorn, the doubt, the uncertainty. He would step into the unknown world of wrestling, no matter how foolish it looked to others. The refusal was not his, it belonged to everyone else. He would not turn away, and with that quiet but firm resolve, the boy from Tampa leaned into the path ahead. The day Hiro Matsuda agreed to train him marked a turning point. Until then, wrestling was only an idea, a distant possibility glimpsed through magazines and television screens. Under Matsuda, it became real. Matsuda carried himself with precision. Every movement was deliberate, every instruction delivered in clipped tones that left no room for argument. His reputation as a world-traveled wrestler gave him authority, but it was his presence that commanded respect. When he stepped onto the mat, the room quieted. Training under him was unlike anything Terry had known. There were no shortcuts, no celebrations, only repetition, sweat and pain. The mat smelled of canvas and salt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as bodies slammed against the floor. Matsuda demanded perfection in the basics: stance,
footwork, the ability to fall and rise without hesitation. Slowly, Terry began to see what Matsuda was building. This was not about muscles or brute force. It was about control, balance, respect for the craft. Protect the man across from you, Matsuda said. If you cannot do that, you do not belong here. The lessons went deeper than the ring. Matsuda spoke of honor, of carrying oneself with dignity. He explained that a wrestler's reputation traveled faster than his name. In a business of constant movement, respect was the only currency that endured. Terry listened closely. For the first time, he had a code to follow. As months passed, Matsuda began to open doors. He introduced Terry to seasoned wrestlers passing through Tampa's territory. Men who spoke of long drives through the night, of tiny gyms packed with shouting fans, of nights spent nursing injuries with no promise of a paycheck. They were road-worn, but their eyes lit up when they described the moment the crowd rose to its feet. For Terry, these stories transformed the dream into something tangible. Through Matsuda, the path ahead no longer seemed distant. It was brutal, uncertain, and costly, but it was real, and for the first time, Terry could see himself walking it. By the mid-1970s, Terry Bowler had trained long enough to know the basics. He could fall without injury, he could absorb punishment and rise again. He understood how to protect an opponent while making the crowd believe every blow, but training in a quiet gym and stepping into a live arena were two different worlds. The moment came when Matsuda told him it was time. His first booking was small, almost hidden, a makeshift venue on the Florida circuit, part armory, part community hall. The kind of place where folding chairs scraped against concrete floors and the scent of beer and popcorn filled the air. Outside, neon lights buzzed. Inside, the crowd was restless, a mix of locals and die-hard wrestling fans who lived for the spectacle of Saturday night shows. Terry walked through the back entrance carrying nothing but his gear. The locker room hummed with low voices and nervous energy. Veterans laced their boots, taped their wrists, and swapped jokes that carried an edge of warning. They studied him with quick glances, curious, skeptical. He was bigger than most, towering over men who had spent years on the road, but size alone meant nothing here. Respect had to be earned. When his name was called, his heart hammered like a drum. The crowd didn't know him. To them, he was just another unknown stepping between the ropes. The ring itself was smaller than it looked on television. The ropes were coarse, the mat hard beneath his boots. Bright lights overhead left the rest of the hall in shadow. The match was not glamorous. He faced a veteran, a journeyman whose role was to test rookies and expose their flaws. Every move Terry had drilled was suddenly harder, with the weight of eyes watching. His timing faltered, his body stiff with nerves. He took blows that rattled his jaw and slammed to the mat with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. The crowd jeered, some shouting insults, others laughing at the green rookie who looked lost. But he endured. He listened to his opponent's whispers in the ring, reminders, cues, corrections. He adjusted, trusted the rhythm, and began to find his footing. By the final minutes he was moving with more confidence, feeding off the noise of the crowd. When the match ended, it was not with a spectacular victory, but with something just as important, survival. He had taken the test and proved he could stay on his feet. The walk back to the locker room was quiet, but inside he was alive. Pain throbbed through his body, but it felt like confirmation. He belonged. More matches followed. Small towns, modest venues, National Guard armories, high school gyms, and fairgrounds. The crowds were never large, but they were loud. Each night brought new lessons. He learned how to work with different opponents, how to react to hostile audiences, how to sell punishment and make every slam believable. The more he wrestled, the more the nerves gave way to instinct. He also learned the grind. Long drives down dark highways with little money in his pocket, sleeping in cheap motels or sometimes in the car, nights where the pay hardly covered gas. The wrestling life was unforgiving, but each hardship was proof he had crossed into a new world. Terry's size began to draw attention. Promoters noticed the way he filled the ring, the way the crowd reacted to his presence, even before he moved. He wasn't polished yet, but he was memorable. For a business built on spectacle, that mattered. In one of his earliest tag matches, the crowd responded with something unexpected. Cheers. They roared when he landed a simple slam, when he raised his massive arms in the air. It was the first taste of connection, the realization that his body, his presence, and his performance could stir an entire room. The sensation was electric. The threshold had been crossed. He was no longer a dreamer or a trainee. He was a professional wrestler, living the life he had once only imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he could not yet see, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would not turn back.
By the late 1970s, Terry Bollea was no longer just a rookie learning to survive. He was beginning to make a name for himself across the Florida wrestling circuit. Promoters saw the size, fans felt the presence, but in wrestling, survival was only the first step. To rise higher, he would have to endure defeats, form alliances, and face rivals who would test his limits. His earliest tests came against veterans who had spent years in the ring, men who knew every trick, every way to expose a newcomer. They pushed him harder than the crowds ever could. Matches were stiff, unforgiving. Each slam to the mat carried a message: pay your dues. More than once he was left battered and humiliated, crawling back to the locker room with nothing to show but bruises and lessons learned. But these defeats became fuel. Terry studied his opponents, learning from every mistake. He realized that power alone could not carry him. He needed presence. He needed to master timing, pacing, and the unspoken rhythm of a match. Slowly he began to adapt. Allies emerged along the way. Among them was Ed Leslie, a young man who shared his drive and became a close companion. Together they trained, traveled, and wrestled as partners. Their friendship went beyond the ring. On the long road trips that defined wrestling life, they kept each other sharp. They pushed one another to stay focused when exhaustion and doubt crept in. Leslie's loyalty gave Terry stability in a world where trust was rare, but the road was filled with enemies too. Rivalries built quickly, often in the heat of competition. Some were staged, designed to ignite the crowd. Others were real. Older wrestlers resented his rapid rise, suspicious of the attention he drew. In their eyes, he had not yet earned the spotlight. In the ring, they made him prove himself. Blows landed harder, holds tightened longer. Each night was both performance and test. The crowds, however, began to respond. They saw in Terry a larger-than-life figure, even before he had a name to match it. His massive frame and explosive moves drew cheers that other rookies rarely earned. Promoters took note. Slowly, his bookings grew. Small gyms gave way to bigger arenas, the noise of hundreds swelling into the roar of thousands. Defeat still found him. In one bout against a seasoned rival, he was pinned in the center of the ring, the crowd erupting as the referee's hand slapped the mat. The loss stung, but afterward, the veteran pulled him aside, offering quiet advice. Don't just fight the man, fight for the people out there. The lesson stayed with him. Wrestling was not only about competition, it was about connection. The psychological battles were as fierce as the physical ones. Long nights on the road, the constant grind of training, the whispers of doubt from those who said he would never last, it all pressed against him. But Terry found strength in the reactions of the fans. When he raised his arms and the crowd rose with him, the fatigue vanished. For those moments, he felt unstoppable. By the end of the decade, he had crossed another threshold. He was no longer a nameless giant learning to survive. He was an attraction, a performer who could draw attention and move a crowd. And then came the victory that proved it. In a packed Florida arena, under blinding lights and the roar of fans, Terry stepped into the ring against one of his toughest rivals. The match was grueling, every move contested, every slam echoing through the building. But this time, he did not falter. He matched the veteran's pace, absorbed the punishment, and delivered it back with precision. When the referee raised his hand in victory, the crowd erupted. It was more than a win, it was validation. Proof that the boy from Tampa had grown into a force worth watching. He had allies at his side, rivals pushing him forward, and the experience of defeat shaping him into something stronger. The threshold was behind him. Ahead waited the larger stage, and the chance to become unforgettable. By the late 1970s, the small halls of Florida could no longer contain him. Terry Bollea had grown into a spectacle, a towering figure whose sheer size made crowds sit up before the match even began. But local fame was not enough. The dream was larger. To make it real, he would have to leave the familiar circuits of the Southeast and step onto a bigger stage. The opportunity came through the wrestling territories that crisscrossed America. In those days, professional wrestling was divided into regions, each ruled by its own promoters and champions. To rise, a wrestler had to travel, proving himself city by city, crowd by crowd. For Terry, the call came from Memphis, a territory known for its rough audiences and relentless schedule. If he could succeed there, he could succeed anywhere. He packed his bags, said goodbye to the humid comfort of Tampa, and drove north. The road stretched endlessly, highways rolling past gas stations, diners and fields that blurred into one another. Memphis was different the moment he arrived. The air was cooler, the culture sharper. This was Elvis country, a place where spectacle mattered. The wrestling fans here were loud, loyal, and unforgiving. They demanded charisma as much as strength. In Memphis, he stepped into a world already dominated by larger-than-life figures. Jerry the King Lawler,
was the reigning hero, a man adored by the crowds. Lawler's swagger, his crown, and his mastery of storytelling in the ring made him both beloved and dangerous. To wrestle here meant stepping into Lawler's kingdom, and for Terry, it was the first encounter with a rival who represented more than just competition. He represented the standard of what a star truly was. At first, the adjustment was rough. Southern crowds shouted louder, booed harder, and cheered with more passion than anything he had known in Florida. They could spot a rookie, and they didn't hesitate to let him know. Every mistake in the ring brought jeers. Every awkward pause drew chants that shook his confidence. For the first time since starting, Terry felt not just tested, but exposed. But the road was also a teacher. Night after night, he wrestled under bright lights in smoky arenas, learning how to play to the crowd. He discovered that his size was not only an advantage, but a story in itself. He could be the unstoppable force, the immovable giant who gave smaller heroes someone to battle. The crowds, once skeptical, began to react. Some booed, others cheered, but no one ignored him. In the locker rooms, he found allies who helped him adapt. Veterans explained the psychology of the Memphis crowd, how to draw them in, how to control their emotions with a glance or a gesture. They reminded him that wrestling was more than physical, it was theatre. Every night was a chance to tell a story, and the wrestler who told it best was the one who won the audience. Facing Jerry Lawler was the ultimate trial. Lawler was quick, cunning, and beloved by the people. Against him, Terry was the outsider, the towering villain meant to be toppled. The matches were electric. Lawler darted across the ring with sharp punches and sudden bursts of energy, while Terry loomed, every move shaking the mat. The crowd roared with each exchange, living and dying by their hero's struggle against the giant. These encounters taught Terry a lesson no gym could provide. It wasn't enough to dominate physically. He had to embody something more, an image, a persona that could captivate just as much as Lawler's crown and cape. He needed a character that would make him unforgettable. In Memphis, the seeds of transformation were planted. He was no longer just Terry Bowler, the big kid from Tampa. He was beginning to see the outlines of something larger, an identity that could carry him into the heart of wrestling's greatest arenas. By the time his run in Memphis ended, he was different. The jeers no longer rattled him, the endless drives no longer drained him. He had faced the fire of hostile crowds, and a rival who embodied everything he wanted to become. And instead of breaking, he grew stronger. The inmost cave was ahead, the world stage of professional wrestling. But now, for the first time, he was fully committed to entering it.
By the early 1980s, the long drives through small towns had paid off. In the Northeast, a young Vince McMahon was reshaping the World Wrestling Federation, dreaming of taking wrestling beyond the territories and into the mainstream. He needed a star, someone who looked like a superhero, someone who could cross from the ring into popular culture. Hulk Hogan was his choice, and so Hogan left the small arenas behind and stepped into Madison Square Garden, the beating heart of McMahon's vision and the proving ground for anyone who wanted to be more than a regional attraction. The lights were blinding, the noise overwhelming, and the expectations higher than ever before. The crowd was a sea of faces, restless and roaring, their energy rattling the very boards of the ring. For years he had travelled the territories, building himself piece by piece. Now, under a new name, Hulk Hogan, he stood at the threshold of something far greater. His rival was not just another wrestler, it was Andre the Giant, a legend in his own time. 7 feet tall, 400 pounds, with hands so large they seemed to swallow everything they touched. To fans, Andre was invincible. To wrestlers, he was untouchable. Stepping into the ring with him was not merely a contest, it was an ordeal. When Hogan first faced Andre, the result was humbling. No matter how strong he was, no matter how loud the crowd shouted, the Giant absorbed it all. Every punch landed like raindrops on a mountain. Every attempt to lift him failed. Hogan was slammed, pinned, and left with the crushing realization that sheer size and power could be dwarfed by something even greater. The loss was not just physical, it was psychological. Backstage, the silence of defeat weighed heavy. Hogan had built his identity around strength, around being larger than life. But against Andre, he had felt small. The Giant exposed his limits, and for the first time, Hogan questioned if he could ever rise above. But doubt quickly turned to determination. Hogan studied Andre obsessively. He trained harder, built his frame thicker, and refined his technique. He learned to pace himself, to wear an opponent down with patience before striking with explosive force. He practiced the impossible, finding a way to lift and slam a man who seemed immovable. The rematch came years later, at the pinnacle of spectacle, WrestleMania 3. Over 93,000 fans packed the Pontiac Silverdome in Michigan, the largest indoor crowd in wrestling history. The air was electric, the noise deafening, a living tide of voices waiting to see if Hogan could do what no man had done before. When Andre stepped into the ring, the stadium seemed to tilt beneath his weight. Hogan followed, draped in yellow and red, every muscle straining with anticipation. The chants shook the arena. Hogan! Hogan! The match was grueling. Andre towered over him, forcing Hogan to dig deep to endure. For long minutes the giant seemed untouchable, his every move crushing. But then, in the moment that would be replayed for decades, Hogan bent his knees, wrapped his massive arms around Andre's body, and with a roar that matched the crowd itself, he lifted the giant into the air. The slam shook the ring. The crowd erupted into chaos, the sound rolling like thunder. Hogan covered Andre, and the referee's hand struck the mat. 1, 2, 3, victory. The image was immortal. Hulk Hogan standing over the fallen giant, chest heaving, sweat glistening under the lights, his arm raised high. In that instant he was no longer just a wrestler, he was a champion of the people, the embodiment of strength and triumph. That victory did more than crown him, it transformed him. From that night, Hulkamania was born. Crowds everywhere erupted at the sound of his music. Children wore his colours, mimicked his poses, and shouted his catchphrases. He was a superhero come to life, larger than the men around him, larger even than the sport itself. Hogan's reign became a period of dominance rarely seen. He defended his title against rival after rival: Macho Man, Randy Savage, Rowdy Roddy Piper, the Iron Sheik, King Kong Bundy. Each feud became a chapter in a saga, each match a battle that drew millions of fans to arenas and televisions. He didn't just win, he inspired. His matches ended with arms flexed, ear cupped to the crowd, the roar swelling into something transcendent. The ordeal had tested him, it had broken him once, then forced him to rise again stronger than before. By lifting Andre, he had lifted himself into legend. Now Hulk Hogan fully possessed the prize he had chased since the beginning. Not just victory, not just fame, but the mantle of icon. He was the face of professional wrestling, the man who stood at the top of a world he had once only glimpsed through a television screen in a small Tampa home. By the mid-1980s, Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler, he was transforming what it meant to be a professional wrestler. The slam heard around the world at WrestleMania 3 had elevated him beyond the ring. He was no longer just a champion, he was a symbol. The yellow and red colours, the ripped shirt, the booming voice, they became part of American culture itself. The timing was perfect. Vince McMahon's vision for the WWF was unfolding. He wanted wrestling to break free from smoky halls and regional circuits to become national entertainment. Cable television, pay-per-view and merchandising were exploding, and Hogan was the face at the centre of it all. Crowds swarmed arenas, children carried lunchboxes stamped with his image, his likeness filled toy stores, posters and comic books. Hulkamania had arrived, and it swept across the country like wildfire, but wrestling alone was not enough. McMahon saw Hogan as the bridge between wrestling and mainstream entertainment, and Hollywood soon came calling. In 1982, Hogan appeared in Rocky III. Cast as Thunderlips, the ultimate male, he towered over Sylvester Stallone in one of the film's most memorable sequences. For Hogan, the role was more than a cameo, it was a revelation. Millions of moviegoers saw him for the first time, not as a wrestler hidden in the subculture of the territories, but as a performer on the silver screen. He learned quickly on set how to work with cameras, how to project beyond the ring, how to merge athleticism with theatre. The film planted a seed. Hogan wasn't just a wrestler, he could be a mainstream star. More roles followed. Some were small, some forgettable, but each one sharpened his understanding of performance. He learned the rhythms of film, the patience required for multiple takes, the way subtle expressions could carry more than raw volume. It was another arena to conquer, and Hogan approached it with the same determination that had carried him through Matsuda's punishing gym years earlier. The true breakthrough came later in the decade. Hollywood was looking for heroes, muscular, indestructible figures who could embody both action and charisma. Hogan fit the mold perfectly. Films like No Holds Barred attempted to capture his wrestling persona on screen, while his appearances on talk shows and in commercials cemented him as a household name. Though critics were rarely kind, the cultural impact was undeniable. To millions of fans, Hogan wasn't just a wrestler or an actor. He was a larger-than-life hero who leapt from television into their living rooms. embodying strength, loyalty, and the promise that good would always triumph. Each appearance, each new role, expanded his reach. The boy from Tampa who once strummed a guitar in smoky bars was now a global celebrity. His voice, his look, his slogans, they carried beyond the ring and into the mainstream of American pop culture. But rewards came with expectations. Success meant new challenges. Wrestling fans wanted more spectacles, bigger matches, higher stakes. Hollywood demanded more polish, more discipline, and Hogan himself began to feel the pressure of carrying both worlds on his shoulders. Still, in this moment he had seized the prize he had chased from the beginning. He was no longer just Terry Bollea, the son of a construction foreman. He was Hulk Hogan, the face of a movement, the man who brought professional wrestling out of the shadows and into the spotlight of mainstream entertainment. The stage was his, the world was watching, and ahead, an even greater challenge waited. The struggle not to win the crown, but to hold it. In America's living rooms, Hulk Hogan was a household presence. His voice opened cartoons, his face covered toy shelves, and his name had become shorthand for strength itself. His image sold action figures, cereal, and lunchboxes. He guest starred on television, appeared in commercials, and headlined pay-per-views that drew millions of eyes. For children, he was a hero. For adults, he was impossible to ignore. The WWF had never seen a figure like him. Every time he ripped his shirt apart in the ring, the arena erupted. Every time he cupped his ear to the crowd, thousands screamed back. Hulkamania wasn't just a slogan, it was a movement, but superstardom came with its own demands. Hogan's schedule was relentless. City after city, night after night, he defended his place at the top. The travel blurred together, the toll on his body grew heavier. Behind the scenes, he carried not just himself, but the business Vince McMahon was building into a global empire. Hollywood, sensing the power of his image, pressed further. After Rocky III, Hogan returned to film with No Holds Barred in 1989. The movie was raw, campy, and brimming with his larger-than-life persona. Though critics dismissed it, the box office proved his drawing power. To fans, Hogan had leapt straight from the ring to the screen, unchanged, still the unstoppable force they adored. But Hogan knew he couldn't remain one-dimensional. The next test was versatility. He leaned into comedy, surprising audiences with his timing and charisma. Films like Suburban Commando and Mr. Nanny showed him in a new light. Playful, self-aware, a giant learning to navigate ordinary worlds. While the movies didn't shatter records, they broadened his appeal. Parents who once rolled their eyes at wrestling now saw Hogan as a family-friendly entertainer. The shift reinforced his place as more than an athlete. He was an all-purpose celebrity. Outside of entertainment, Hogan treated his career like a business. He licensed his image aggressively. Video games, animated series, and endorsements multiplied. He became a brand. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a man, he was a corporation. His strategy was simple: expand beyond the ring, plant roots in every corner of popular culture, and ensure that wherever people looked, they saw the yellow and red. Yet the bigger he became, the more the pressure mounted. Every move was scrutinized, every deal came with expectations. Behind the charisma, the strain of constant visibility began to show. Injuries piled up, the grind of wrestling never slowed, and whispers of scandal about backstage politics, about steroid use, about personal struggles began to circle. Still, in the public eye, he remained untouchable. When the music hit and he stepped through the curtain, he was pure energy, a man who symbolized triumph, resilience, and spectacle. He had climbed the mountain, and now he stood firmly at the summit. Champion in the ring, star on the screen, a brand recognized around the world. But Hogan's nature was restless. Holding the crown was never enough. There was always another challenge on the horizon, another mountain waiting. Wrestling had given him fame, Hollywood had widened his reach, business had made him an empire. The question was no longer whether he could rise, it was what he would do with the throne he had built. The next chapter would test him in ways no ring could contain. By the early 1990s, the shine of Hulkamania had begun to fade. What once felt fresh and larger than life now seemed predictable. Crowds that used to erupt with cheers were growing restless, some even turning on him. The bright colors, the catchphrases, the endless victories, fans who once lived by his words began to boo them. Behind the curtain, the business was changing. The WWF was under fire from scandals about steroid use, and Hogan's name was tied to the headlines. At the same time, a younger, edgier generation of wrestlers was emerging, promising something different, something more in step with the mood of the decade. Suddenly, the invincible hero of the 1980s looked out of place in the darker world of the 1990s. For Hogan, it was a fall from grace. The company that he had carried to new heights no longer felt like home. Fans were tired of the old hero, and the man himself began to wonder if the end had come. By the mid-1990s, Hulk Hogan's golden era seemed finished.
The hero in yellow and red, once adored by millions, had grown stale in the eyes of fans. The clean-cut champion who preached the virtues of training, prayers and vitamins, no longer fit a world drifting toward darker, edgier entertainment. Crowds that once cheered began to boo. Children still clung to Hulkamania, but older audiences were restless. They wanted something new. Behind the curtain, Hogan faced a choice: fade into memory as the relic of a brighter, simpler era, or reinvent himself completely. The opportunity came in World Championship Wrestling, WWF's southern rival. By the mid-90s, WCW was mounting a serious challenge, armed with national TV slots and the ambition to dethrone Vince McMahon's empire. They needed Hogan's star power, but Hogan needed something even more: a rebirth. The moment came in 1996 at WCW's Bash at the Beach. Hogan shocked the wrestling world. He turned his back on the fans who once idolized him, aligning himself with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Together they formed the New World Order, the NWO. It was betrayal on the grandest stage. Gasps filled the arena as children wept and adults hurled garbage into the ring. The hero of the 1980s had become the villain of the 1990s. The transformation was complete. Gone were the red and yellow. In their place came black and white, spray-painted logos, and a sneer that erased years of smiles. As Hollywood Hogan, he taunted the same audiences who once raised him on their shoulders. He spoke with arrogance, reveled in hatred, and made the NWO the hottest act in professional wrestling. The strategy worked. WCW surged in popularity, dominating television ratings for 83 straight weeks. Wrestling, once considered fading, roared back into mainstream relevance. Hogan was at the center of it all. The man who had once carried the WWF into the national spotlight was now the villain leading WCW to its greatest success. Behind the scenes, it was not without cost. Power struggles brewed in the locker room. Younger wrestlers complained that Hogan's influence stifled their rise. His creative control clause, rare in wrestling contracts, gave him unusual sway over storylines. Yet for WCW's owners, the results were undeniable. Pay-per-views soared, merchandise flew off shelves. Hollywood Hogan was not just a wrestler, he was the lightning rod that carried an entire company. The resurrection of Hogan's career was more than a storyline, it was a reflection of cultural change. The 1990s audience craved anti-heroes, darker, grittier figures who blurred the line between good and evil. Hogan's reinvention showed an adaptability few thought he had. By embracing the boos, by becoming the villain, he stayed relevant in a business that discards its past quickly. For Hogan, the NWO years were both triumphant and turbulent. He faced fierce battles in the ring with legends like Sting, Goldberg, and Randy Savage. Some matches became iconic, others controversial, but through it all, Hogan remained at the center of conversation. He had proved something critical. He was not trapped in one role. He could evolve, survive, and thrive in an entirely new form. By the early 2000s, WCW collapsed under its own weight and was eventually bought by the WWF. Hogan, thought to be finished yet again, returned to the company he once left behind, and in a twist no one predicted, the fans who had booed him for years welcomed him back with open arms. At WrestleMania X8 in 2002, Hogan faced The Rock in a battle that spanned generations. The crowd erupted, not for the younger star, but for the man they had once rejected. For one night, Hulkamania returned in full force. It was the ultimate resurrection. The hero who became the villain had come full circle, transformed by betrayal, reinvention, and endurance. His place in wrestling history was secure, not because he remained the same, but because he had changed and endured. Hogan closed this chapter of his life a different man. No longer the untouchable icon of the 1980s, no longer the despised villain of the 1990s, he was something more complex. A survivor, a figure who had shaped, broken, and reshaped professional wrestling through sheer force of will. The resurrection was complete, and ahead lay the uncertain question of what comes after legacy. Hulk walked away from the ring more than once, but somehow he always returned. The matches grew fewer, the body slower, yet the moment his music hit, the crowd still rose. They weren't just cheering for a wrestler anymore, they were cheering for a memory, for the man who had defined their childhoods. Away from the spotlight, his life was far more complicated. Hogan settled in Clearwater, Florida, the city he would call home for much of his later years. There, the red and yellow superhero became simply Terry Bollea, a man trying to balance fame with family. His reality series, Hogan Knows Best, pulled back the curtain, showing him not as an untouchable icon, but as a father and husband, dealing with everyday struggles. Cameras followed family arguments, career choices, and the challenges of raising children under the glare of celebrity. It was raw, sometimes messy, and often painful, but it revealed the human side of a man who had once seemed larger than life. Not all headlines were kind. Lawsuits, scandals, and betrayals chipped away at the myth. The most public of them came in 2016, when Hogan stood at the center of one of the most sensational legal battles of the decade. After his private life was splashed across the internet by gossip site Gawker, Hogan sued. With the help of tech billionaire Peter Thiel, who also had ill will toward Gawker, Hogan was able to hire a top-notch legal team. The courtroom became another kind of arena. When the jury ruled in his favor, awarding him a massive settlement, it was both vindication and spectacle. For once the battle wasn't fought with body slams or promos, but with lawyers and testimony. And yet the outcome reminded the world that Hulk Hogan was still capable of rewriting his story. In Clearwater, he found pockets of peace. Fans spotted him at the beach, in restaurants, or walking through town, the mustache and bandana unmistakable even in casual moments. He carried the air of a man who had lived larger than most, and bore the scars of it too. His later years were marked by reflection. He spoke openly about faith, about mistakes, about the price of living under a spotlight for so long. He appeared on WWE programming occasionally, welcomed as a legend, sometimes controversial, but always unforgettable.
And despite the years of triumphs and controversies, he remained one of wrestling's most enduring names, an icon whose shadow stretched across generations. In 2025, Hulk Hogan passed away at the age of 71. The news rippled across the world. Wrestlers, fans, celebrities, and ordinary people paused to remember not just the character in yellow and red, but the man behind it. Tributes filled arenas and timelines. For many, it felt like the closing of a chapter, not just in wrestling, but in their own lives. Hogan's legacy was complicated, equal parts glory and scandal, triumph and failure, but perhaps that is why it endures. He embodied the extremes of fame, the hero, the villain, the survivor. He was adored, reviled, cheered, and doubted, but always unforgettable. Terry Bollea had dreamed of being larger than life. As Hulk Hogan, he became just that. He carried wrestling from regional halls to global arenas, from television screens to the heart of popular culture. He left behind more than victories or championships. He left behind an era, one of bright lights, roaring crowds, and the roar of Hulkamania echoing through time. And when the final curtain fell, his impact remained. Hulk Hogan was more than a man, he was a myth. And myths never truly leave us.